This morning, our reflections are on the fourth principle. The fourth principle is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. As responsible religious seekers, we recognize that we are privileged to be free, to have resources to pursue life beyond mere survival, to continually search for truth and meaning, to exist beyond bonds of dogma and oppression, and to wrestle freely with truth and meaning as they evolve. This privilege calls us not to be isolated and self-centered, believing that our single perspective trumps all others, but rather to be humble, to be open to the great mysteries of truth and meaning that life offers. And those mysteries may speak to us through our own intuition and experience, but also through tradition, community, conflict, nature, and relationships. As a faith tradition, Unitarian Universalism makes sacred the right and responsibility to engage in this free and responsible quest as an act of religious devotion. Institutionally, we have left open the questions of what truth and meaning are, acknowledging that mindful people will, in every age, discover new insights. The Reverend Paige Getty, the UU Congregation of Columbia, Maryland.
Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Hold my hand while I run this race. Hold my hand while I run this race. Hold my hand while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Stand by me while I run this race. Stand by me while I run this race. Stand by me while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Search my heart while I run this race. Search my heart while I run this race. Search my heart while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain.
Our opening words are number 444 in the back of your hymnal, and this is a responsive reading. This house is for the ingathering of nature and human nature.
It is a house of friendships, a haven in trouble, an open room for the encouragement of our struggle.
It is a house of freedom, guarding the dignity and worth of every person.
It offers a platform for the free voice, for declaring, both in times of security and danger, the full and undivided conflict of opinion.
It is a house of truth-seeking, where scientists can encourage devotion to their quest, where mystics can abide in a community of searchers.
It is a house of art, adorning its celebrations with melodies and handiworks.
It is a house of prophecy, outrunning times past and times present in visions of growth and progress.
This house is a cradle for our dreams, the workshop of our common endeavor.
Our transitional words are number 561, Wisdom from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. It is my honor to introduce Bob Dodson. He will be sharing with us some of his work that he has been doing with the Poor People's Campaign.
To understand the Poor People's Campaign, we need a little historical background. I will start with a favorite King quotation, which I believe is one of the inspirations for the Poor People's Campaign. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This idea inspired King to lead the civil rights movement to end segregation in the South, where he was instrumental in the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and became pivotal in leading civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance campaigns. His nonviolent tactics allowed him to gain allies in the labor movement and in the white-dominated religious dominations of the North, resulting in a fusion coalition. As time went on, his labor union partners caused King to broaden his focus from civil rights to economic justice. This led to involvement in a massive march on Washington for jobs and freedom. After overcoming sabotage and government interference, the march came together with over 250,000 in attendance. Dr. King provided the concluding address at the Lincoln Memorial with his memorable "I Have a Dream" speech. After the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the civil rights movement experienced two of its greatest victories: the ratification of the 24th Amendment, which abolished the poll tax, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which outlawed racial discrimination in employment and outlawed segregation in public facilities. The following year, the Voting Rights Act was passed. King's focus on injustice broadened further in 1967, probably as a result of the ongoing harm that the Vietnam War was doing to the poor. It was in that year that he gave a speech in Atlanta where he articulated the interrelatedness of the oppression faced by the poor. The triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism are forms of violence that exist in a vicious cycle. They are interrelated, all-inclusive, and stand as barriers to our living in the beloved community. When we work to remedy one evil, we affect all evils. In another speech given the same year, King again drew the connection between poverty and militarism. We spent approximately $500,000 to kill a single enemy soldier in Vietnam, and yet spend $53 for each impoverished American in anti-poverty programs. Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Workers began to conceive of a plan to focus the nation's attention on the scourge of poverty. This led to the development of a Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. The campaign would help the poor by dramatizing their needs, uniting all races under the commonality of hardship, and present a plan to start a solution. The campaign united people from many backgrounds: Black, white, Native American, Hispanic farm workers, unions, progressive white moral leaders, to demand $30 billion for an anti-poverty package, a commitment to full employment, a guaranteed annual income, and building more low-income housing. The following year, in April 3rd of 1968, Dr. King came to Memphis to help the sanitation workers in their struggle for decent conditions of employment. He saw the effort as an integral part of the Poor People's Campaign. The following day, as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, he was shot in the left cheek and killed. AFSCAM and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference continued with King's plans for a Poor People's Campaign, but faced a hostile reception in Washington. The modern idea to take King's work and turn it into a modern force for justice is the result of a collaboration between an organization founded by the Reverend William Barber II called Repairers of the Breach and Kairos Institute. Repairers of the Breach is a not-for-profit that, quote, seeks to build a moral agenda rooted in a framework that uplifts our deepest moral and constitutional values to redeem the heart and soul of our country, unquote. The Kairos Center is a national organization, quote, committed to building a movement to end poverty led by the poor. Drawing on the power of religious and human rights, it is a center for movement strategy, coordination, and education among the poor across all lines of division. The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, builds on King's triple evils and his moral and nonviolent religious framing and fusion organizing to heal divisions and to educate and unite the poor in the fight for economic justice. The present campaign is built on fighting 5 interlocking injustices: poverty, racism, environmental devastation, militarism, and the false moral narratives that are used to justify poverty and blame the poor. Here is one example of the false narrative in modern politics. The poor are poor due to laziness, sin, and degradation. These vices are typical among immigrants and in the black community. Dog whistles like welfare queen, drug dealers, and welfare cheats are used to imply that the poor are black and that they are undeserving. This in turn can be used to elect officials who will be tough on crime and cut poverty programs. The voter is motivated by racism to vote against the interests of all poor people. Fighting the false narratives involves replacing these with truth, using fundamental religious and civic documents, using history, economic research, and the testimony of those who have fallen into poverty to prove that injustice is based on lies. At first, it may be hard to see the interlocking connections between poverty, racism, environment, and militarism. So let's take a look at some of these connections. When we consider the numerous environmental crises our world is facing, or other issues, such as the crisis our democracy is facing, or the growth of poverty and homelessness, or even the resurgence of racism and increasing militarism, we need to examine our economic system with its invisible hand of plausible deniability. The accepted myth of laissez-faire capitalism is that there is a free market in which a myriad of buyers and sellers, the magic of competition, will result in the greatest efficiency and greatest production and lowest possible prices. The myth tells us that this will result in higher living standards for all. Another false assumption made by Smith was that resources are unlimited and that the earth has an unlimited capacity to absorb and clean up the byproducts of production. Actually, the system was built on a foundation of conceits, that greed is a foundation for good, that some humans are superior and therefore entitled to exploit others. First, the great chain of being justified nobility and the divine right of kings. Later, during the colonial period, the myth that white Christians were entitled to rule over lesser races was used to justify the immorality of stealing their property and lives. The productivity and low prices promised required legal maneuvering and dehumanization. This was first used on the peasantry to strip them of common lands. These lies were then required to dehumanize indigenous people, to strip them of resources and lands, and were required again to dehumanize Africans who were enslaved and their labor expropriated. Exploitation of nature was also required the conceit that nature must be conquered and that natural resources were inexhaustible. These lies were used to obscure the fact that fundamental religious teachings were being violated and corrupted by the greedy and powerful in the quest for wealth. The system as it operates today also requires lies and deniability to justify its results. It requires production at the lowest possible cost to stay in business, requiring workers to be paid the lowest possible wages. This in turn requires impoverishment or exploitation of workers and their vilification should they try to unionize or strike. The system requires that all resources are monetized and can be procured by private interests for the production process. Ecological value and the greater good is ignored. This means that those with money bid for scarce resources against those with less money at their disposal. This is true in the marketplace for resources and in the market for food, housing, water, fuel, transportation, etc. Those without money go without. They are forced to sell their land, possessions, labor, or even themselves. The system requires sacrificial peoples and sacrificial zones so that these peoples' resources and lands can be exploited, or so that their labor can be appropriated, whether through slavery, debt bondage, prison labor, or simply wages which ignore the cost of living. These sacrifice zones will be in areas which have resources but lack income and wealth, or lack political and military power. The system offers producers, stockholders, and bargain-hunting consumers plausible deniability because the exploitation is the result of impersonal forces. It also produces complicity, making it difficult to criticize the system for the affluent. The system values people either in terms of the labor they can contribute to production or in terms of their purchasing power as consumers. Those without either are considered disposable because they have no productive or consumptive value. The system is deeply at odds with our supposed religious and moral values, which value the least of these. The systemic beast corrupts all participants, including consumers, who only buy the cheapest products, no matter the effect on the earth or fellow citizens, and even those saving for retirement, who demand the highest returns on investments, despite the effect on wages of their neighbors or the health of their grandchildren. This system has brought humanity to the brink of extinction through ecocide. The features of our actual system, which do provide income for the poor or elderly or sick individuals, have to do with pre-capitalistic, humane, or religious values, and have required the intervention of government to address such humane or religious concerns. Most of these were added during the progressive period, 1900 to 1917, or during the period 1930 to 1962. These humane features are under attack as too expensive and as interfering with, quote, freedom by many political leaders who seem to believe that taxes must be reduced on corporations and the wealthy who must have freedom to plunder and pollute. In the theoretical laissez-faire capitalist myth, there is competition to keep prices low. Without government intervention to enforce competition, the natural inclination of business is to eliminate it. This is done by means of driving the competition out of business, buying it, or by means of legal copyrights and patents. The result is monopoly pricing. During much of the 20th century, Most of our sacrifice zones were hidden from the public because they were in foreign countries like Vietnam, Nicaragua, Chile, Guatemala, El Salvador, Libya, or Iraq, the result of foreign wars and imperial foreign policy, or in poverty-stricken or underdeveloped parts of the South, like West Virginia or Mississippi. This was because, at that time, there was a consensus that government existed to regulate and manage the excesses of the capitalist system here at home. The consensus began to disintegrate in the 1980s with the ascension of the neoliberal ideas of Milton Friedman. This school of economics championed classic free market economics on a worldwide stage. The advent of world trade agreements and the ability of corporations to avoid regulation of labor, environmental, health standards, commitments to pensions, and labor agreements by simply moving their operations. Governments have had much less ability to rein in the exploitive nature of the system. As a result of falling wages and rising costs of living, large portions of American working class, as well as many of its smaller farms, have become the latest sacrifice population, and larger swathes of the nation are becoming sacrifice zones in terms of air and water quality. We now have 140 million poor and low-income Americans. As wages have fallen and investments in infrastructure have fallen, many small businesses and small farms have been supplanted or made subservient to corporate interest. Our legislators have consistently cut taxes on large corporations, and their profits have soared. The process has been accelerated by the corruption of our politics, by a flood of dark money, and by the power of concentrated wealth to control the messaging and the media. Government, too, is seen as a commodity or resource to be bought and sold by the highest bidder. Recently, the payoffs have resulted in suspension of environmental protection, stalled action on climate justice, additional subsidies for the oil industry, free speech rights for corporations, and fewer voting rights for individuals. Preying on the impoverished population has become an important business model for banks hawking payday loans and subprime mortgages, for junk food vendors hawking calories in food deserts, for bail bondsmen and private prisons. The contamination of our air and water and climate destabilization offer additional opportunities for profit and impoverishment. The new model could be called disaster capitalism. Global warming promises a bonanza. The privatization of schools, water systems, postal and health services means that the population pays an ever steeper price for subsidizing free enterprise. The crisis of democracy, racial justice, environmental devastation, militarism, and the growing poverty has been met by many single interest organizations, and this has made it difficult to define the problem and to coalesce around a progressive platform that could grapple with the extent of the problem. There are insufficient numbers of voters who would support such a platform. The genius of the Poor People's Campaign is that it addresses both issues. It will fuse the various interest groups fighting for environment, peace and justice, and racial justice, and economic justice into a movement with a coherent agenda while allowing them to retain their independence. Centering the movement around issues of poverty and creating a platform where the poor have a voice will give the poor who currently do not vote in large numbers a reason to do so. This will change the electoral equation. Finally, changing the moral narrative and taking back moral language from false Christians who have forsaken Christ's teachings and seem to worship power, economic advantage, whiteness, male dominance, and firearms will allow the movement to unite true moral leaders and their followers from every religious tradition. Only such a coalition will have the power to take on the economic interests that are destroying civil society and throwing so many into poverty and destroying our planet. Okay, the mass assembly on June 18th is to raise consciousness, break through the media silence around the issue of poverty, make the nation aware of the interlocking injustices that lead to poverty and homelessness, and the assembly will raise the profile of the Poor People's Campaign, and this will spur the growth of the movement. It will put politicians on notice that there is a growing demand for progressive reform and a demand for a specific set of reforms that will address social and environmental problems. We hope to use the momentum from the assembly to gain, and the new members that are gained, to mobilize voters in the fall.
The closing hymn is 170, We Are a Gentle, Angry People.
We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gay and straight together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gay and straight together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives.
The closing words from James the First. Be doers of the word and not merely hearers, those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act. They will be blessed in their doing.
May the blessings of love rest upon you. May peace abide with you. May God's presence illuminate your heart now and forevermore.
Go in peace. peace, know that you are loved and that your life is sacred.